She was already crying when I got home. Not the loud kind, the kind you can't hear through a closed door. The kind you only know about because the walls in that apartment were thin as paper. And I'd learned the particular silence she made when she was trying not to let it be heard. I stood in the hallway, keys still in my hand, and counted the seconds. 7 nights in a row. Same time. Same quiet devastation behind the door of room 2. I almost knocked that first night. Talked myself out of it. Second night, I made tea I didn't drink, stood in the kitchen, went to bed. Third night, I sent her a text from 12 feet away. "Hey, you good?" She replied, "Yep, just tired, Lowell." 4 words and an emoji that meant, "Please don't ask again." So I didn't. I did what people do. I respected the silence, which is another way of saying I was afraid of what lived inside it. I told myself she'd come to me if she needed me. I told myself everyone goes through phases. I was very convincing. What I didn't know was what she was carrying. What I didn't know was that by night 7, she had already decided something. And if I didn't knock on that door in the next 48 hours, she was going to stop carrying it entirely. That's the part she told me later, after everything. That's the part that still wakes me up at 2 in the morning and makes me ask myself, what if I'd sent a second text? Her name was Priya. We'd been roommates for 8 months, long enough to know each other's grocery schedules, short enough that we'd never once talked about anything that actually mattered. She was a second-year master's student in biochemistry. I was finishing a paralegal certification. We had different hours, different worlds, different kitchens in the same kitchen. She was quiet. I was polite. We were the kind of roommates who coexist in the warmest possible way without ever touching the surface of each other's lives. She had a boyfriend. Had. Past tense, though I didn't know that yet. His name was Daniel, and he appeared in our apartment exactly 3 times in 8 months. Each visit slightly shorter than the last, like he was testing how little he could get away with. I remember thinking, that man treats her like an appointment he keeps rescheduling. But it wasn't my business, and Priya never made it my business, and I filed it under none of your concern and moved on. The crying started on a Monday. Not gradual, sudden, like a switch. I came home to a different apartment, a version of our space that had a new weight to it, a wrongness I felt in my chest before I could name it. Something had happened. I didn't know what. I told myself I'd give it a day. By Thursday, I'd learned the rhythm of it. She came home around 9, went straight to her room, and somewhere between 9:30 and 10, it started. Not always tears I could hear, sometimes just the stillness of a person fighting themselves into silence. I'd stand in the kitchen pretending to clean already clean counters and think, there is a person 12 feet away from me who is not okay. I did nothing. On Friday, I made pasta for 2, left a plate outside her door, texted her it was there. She ate it. She texted back, "Thank you, Nadia. You didn't have to." I went to sleep telling myself that counted. It did not count. Saturday morning, she was in the kitchen when I came out. And for the first time in a week, she looked at me with her actual face instead of the performed one. The dark circles. The specific kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. She had her laptop open to a document she wasn't reading, a mug of tea she'd forgotten about, and the rigid posture of a person bracing for something. I almost said good morning and reached past her for the coffee. I almost did. Instead, I sat down across from her and I said, "Hey, how long has it been going on?" She looked at me. I said, "The crying, through the wall, I heard it. I should have asked sooner." Something happened to her face. Not breaking, the opposite. like something that had been forced shut for 7 days, finally had permission to open. She put down the mug. She looked at the laptop. She looked back at me. She said, "I don't know where to start." I said, "Anywhere is fine. I have nowhere to be." What came out over the next 2 hours was not a simple story. It never is. 3 weeks before the crying started, Daniel had ended things. Not in person, a phone call. 11 minutes. She'd timed it after, she said, because she needed to measure how much 11 minutes costs a person. The answer, she found out, is quite a lot. That part I'd expected. What I hadn't expected was the second thing. 2 days after the breakup, she'd gotten a call from her university's financial office. Her funding, the grant that covered her tuition, her stipend, her health insurance, the reason she could afford to be in this country getting this degree, had been flagged for non-renewal. An administrative error, they said. Someone had failed to resubmit a form. Her advisor had been notified. The funding committee had been notified. A decision would be made by the end of the month. The end of the month was 11 days away. If the funding didn't come through, her visa status would be affected. She had 60 days to either find alternative funding or leave. Leave the program, leave the country, leave 8 months of research, 2 years of her life, and the career she had built every day since she was 14 years old, reading biochemistry textbooks in a room with broken air conditioning, because she'd decided she was going to do this, no matter what it took. 11 days. She said it so quietly, I made her repeat it. 11 days, she said. And I haven't slept more than 3 hours at a time since I found out. I asked why she hadn't told me. Any of it. I asked why she'd answered, "Yep." Just tired, my text. Why she'd performed fine for 7 nights in a row in the one apartment where she might have been allowed to not be fine. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because asking for help means admitting it's real. And if it's real, I have to think about what happens if I lose." That sentence has never left me. Here is what I knew, working as a paralegal. Administrative errors in funding decisions are not always errors. Sometimes they are oversights. Sometimes they are the result of one person failing to click a button. And sometimes, they are the result of something that looks like an oversight, but is, on examination, something with a different name. I asked Priya if I could see the communications she'd received. She showed me everything. The initial notice, the follow-up, the email from her advisor. And then, because she'd been thorough, even in crisis, she was always thorough. That's the thing about people like Priya. They document even when they're drowning. She showed me a thread of emails from 6 months earlier that she'd never thought to connect until now. Her previous advisor had left the department under circumstances that were described in the official communication as a mutual parting of ways and in the department gossip as something considerably less mutual. When he left, he'd taken 3 graduate students with him to his new institution. Priya had stayed. She had stayed, and she had been assigned a new advisor, and she had assumed that was the end of it. She had not realized that the person who had failed to resubmit her funding form was the administrator whose primary responsibility had been the departing advisor's students. She had not realized that the timeline of the non-resubmission aligned precisely with the week that advisor had announced his new position. She had not realized that she was the only student in her cohort whose funding had been flagged. She hadn't connected any of this because she was in the middle of it. Because she was 3 hours of sleep at a time, because her boyfriend had left, and then her funding had left, and the world felt like it was contracting. And sometimes when everything goes wrong at once, you can't see the pattern because the pattern requires distance you don't have. I could see it. "I need you to forward me everything," I said. "Every single email in this chain going back 12 months. and I need the name and contact information for the chair of the funding committee." She stared at me. I said, "This is not an accident, Priya. Or if it is, it's the kind of accident that needs an explanation in writing. And you need someone in your corner who knows how to ask for things in writing." The next 6 days were the longest of my year. I drafted the letter that Monday, formal, specific, citing the timeline discrepancy, the pattern of selective non-resubmission, the connection to the departed advisor, the absence of any similar oversight affecting his students who had followed him. I cited the university's own stated obligations to international graduate students under their funding agreements. I did not accuse. I documented. Priya's new advisor, a woman named Dr. Rice, who turned out to have approximately 0 patience for administrative negligence, reviewed the letter Tuesday morning and forwarded it to the department chair with her own note attached. A note that I later heard described as pointed. Wednesday, the funding committee requested a formal response from the administrative office. Thursday, the administrator in question submitted a correction and a letter of explanation that contained, in its second paragraph, the phrase "an oversight," for which I take full responsibility. Friday, 6 days before Priya's deadline, her funding was reinstated. Full amount, retroactive to the flagged period. A formal apology was issued to her academic file. I was in the kitchen when she came out of her room holding her phone. She had been crying again, but this was different, and I knew the difference immediately. I had learned the geography of her silences by then, which sounds like a small thing and is not a small thing at all. She said, "It's back." I said, "I know." She crossed the kitchen and she hugged me, which we had never done in 8 months of living together and which lasted a very long time. I held on. I didn't say anything useful. I just stayed. In the weeks after, Priya asked me once why I'd finally knocked. I told her the truth. I almost didn't. I had talked myself out of it every night for 7 nights with the same logic, that it wasn't my place, that she'd come to me, that respecting someone's silence is its own form of care. And all of that logic was wrong. Not unkind, but wrong. Silence is not always a boundary. Sometimes it is a weight a person is carrying until someone gives them a reason to put it down. The night I asked, I didn't have a plan. I just sat down and said, "How long has it been going on?" That's it. That was the door. She walked through it. What I know now that I didn't know then: the people who have already decided they won't ask are waiting for someone to ask them first. Not to be rescued, not to have the problem solved. She never asked me to solve it. She asked me if she could tell me. That is different. The solving came after, because I happened to have a skill that was useful. But the solving was not the point. The point was a table, a forgotten mug of tea, and someone sitting down and saying, "I have nowhere to be." Priya defended her thesis 18 months later. Dr. Rice was in the front row. I was in the third row, crying the loud kind this time, not caring who heard. We still have dinner every few months. It's the kind of friendship that starts with walls and ends without them. I didn't make any grand gesture. I just knocked on the door. There is someone you know, I'd bet everything on this, who has been answering fine to your questions for longer than they should have. Not because they're lying, because they don't know yet if you're the person who will stay when it gets heavy. You can be that person with a table and a cup of coffee and 4 words. I have nowhere to be. Has there ever been someone in your life who was silently falling apart while you kept a polite, careful distance? What stopped you from knocking? And what finally made you? Subscribe for stories about the moments when people chose to stay.